Welcome online viewers. This is the first lecture in a series of 12 sponsored by the Drill Hall Gallery at the Australian University. My name is Terence Maloon. This lecture series has the general title of the 50 Years That Changed Painting. There will be 12 in the series. Eventually, all will become accessible online. On behalf of the Drill Hall Gallery, I'd like to convey special thanks to Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly, who have generously sponsored this series and its transfer online. The 50 Years That Changed Painting spans from 1867 to 1917, strictly speaking, and so this first lecture might seem a bit of an outlier. Honoré de Balzac, represented here in a famous sculpture by Rodin, was an enormously important novelist. Oscar Wilde quipped that Balzac had invented the 19th century, and in a sense, he actually did. Henry James called Balzac really the father of us all, that is to say, the father of all modern novelists. In 1831, Balzac published a short story called Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu, the unknown masterpiece, which appeared in 2 installments in a magazine called L'Artiste. L'Artiste identified itself as a journal of literature and the fine arts, and so we could surmise that Balzac's story was deliberately pitched to appeal to both constituencies of the readership. We can assume there was some division there, but that is actually quite unlikely, given this particular time frame when visual artists and art lovers in general were avid readers of fiction, and when writers and the literary world generally took a lively interest in what was currently going on in the visual arts. The lifetime of Balzac was set in a revolutionary era, and environmental, political, economic, and psychological shockwaves were having their effect across the whole range of cultural expression. Disturbances in the literary realm and controversies in the fine arts were part of the tenor of the time. Nonetheless, they would have been experienced more immediately and directly in some places rather than others. They would also have been perceptible much earlier in some places, and they would have seemed more interesting and more relevant to some people than to others. Balzac was certainly at the epicenter of things, and he was a brilliant observer and diagnostician of the contemporary world. How brilliant an observer and diagnostician was he? Well, for some, he was unique and indispensable. Friedrich Engels, for instance, has attested, and I quote his words, "I've learnt more from Balzac than from all the professional historians, economists, and statisticians put together." For Charles Baudelaire, the great French poet and art critic, 22 years Balzac's junior, Balzac was a passionate visionary and prodigious meteor. The historical significance of Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu vis-à-vis the subsequent development of modern art does indeed bear the stamp of a passionate visionary. It's an act of amazing foresight, appearing like a bolt from the blue, or, if you will, a prodigious meteor. Our story begins here, on the left bank in Paris, in this street, the Rue des Grands Augustins. We are heading towards number 7, which is a 17th century mansion formerly the Hôtel de Savoie-Carignan. The photo on the left is by Balzac, showing Picasso's studio. Picasso lived here between 1936 and 1955, as the sign outside the building proclaims. The sign says that in the studio, Picasso painted Guernica in 1937, and goes on to say that here also Balzac situated the action of his novella Le chef-d'œuvre inconnu. It's not altogether accurate, in fact. It was only the opening scene of Balzac's story that was situated here. Françoise Gillot, who was Picasso's common-law wife between 1943 and 1953, has recounted the first time she visited Picasso in his studio and how he had remarked to her, "That covered staircase you walked up to get here is the one the young painter in Balzac's Le chef-d'œuvre inconnu climbed when he went to see Paul Bus, the friend of Poussin, who painted pictures nobody understood. Oh, the whole place is full of historical and literary ghosts." This account is a little bit garbled too, but we'll let the fact pass. The most significant thing here is the mention of historical and literary ghosts, the historical and literary ghosts that haunted Picasso to the end of his days, as this etching he made in 1971 corroborates. The studio apartment at number 7 occupied the 2 upper floors of the building. Picasso's old friend Balzac, who took these photographs, knew this place before Picasso took occupancy. Balzac had visited the writer Georges Bataille, who lived there, and had also attended performances held in the loft, which was occupied then by the famous actor Jean-Louis Barrault. It was Picasso's girlfriend of the time, Dora Maar, who alerted Picasso in 1936 to the fact that the premises were about to become available for rent. Balzac remembered on a larger scale the premises, recalled the Bateau Lavoir, that is to say, the ramshackle complex of studios in Montmartre, where Picasso had lived as a very young man. One could imagine being in the interior of a ship, its gangways, its storerooms, its hold. The description that Balzac gives of the house, the steep and gloomy staircase, has a striking resemblance. Moved and stimulated by the idea of taking the place of the illustrious shade of Frenhofer, Frenhofer being the principal character of Balzac's story, Picasso immediately rented the studio. These 2 etchings from Picasso's Suite 347 were done on consecutive days of April 1968. Are they evocations of those places full of historical and literary memories that Picasso had left behind when he left Paris 13 years earlier? And if Picasso continued to be moved and stimulated by the idea of taking the place of Frenhofer, as Balzac states, why should this fact strike us as so very strange and so deeply puzzling? Wasn't Frenhofer famously, notoriously, a tragic failure, the tragic victim of his obsessional delusions? Wasn't Balzac's story intended as a cautionary tale? What was it that appealed to Picasso in this particular story? For the next couple of minutes, it's story time. You won't have any more images passing before your eyes. However, I ought to warn you that the story you'll be hearing is a highly simplified version, shorn of much descriptive detail and of the vivid accounts the characters give of their intentions and aspirations, and much besides. You really should take the time and read this story for yourself if you haven't done so already. As we've seen, Balzac's story is set in real places. At least the opening section has a verifiable location. There are also two characters who bear the names of well-known painters. There is the very young Nicolas Poussin, who's just arrived in Paris from the provinces. He's very unsure of himself, but during the course of the story, he becomes aware of the strength of his artistic calling, of his destiny to be a great artist. He also becomes aware of the force of his ambition, which is quite an unpleasant discovery for him and for us as well, because his ambition is revealed to be completely unscrupulous and ruthless, just destroying the innocent, or at first innocent-seeming, love between himself and his beautiful mistress, Gillette. The other artist who has a real name in the story is Frans Pourbus, a Flemish painter who worked for the royal court in Paris. Balzac Frenchifies his name to François Pourbus. One day in the year 1612, the young Nicolas Poussin arrives at a large mansion in the Rue des Grands Augustins. Very hesitant and inhibited, he hopes to make the acquaintance of Pourbus, an artist he admires, and who, he knows, has a studio in this building. While he's dithering about how he might present himself to Pourbus, he's overtaken on the stairway by a strangely intense, agitated, grotesque old man on his way, as it turns out, to visit Pourbus. When the studio door opens, Pourbus assumes that Poussin is an acquaintance of the old man's, whereas the old man assumes Poussin is a friend of Pourbus. That's how Poussin insinuates his way into the studio, and how, during the dialogue that ensues between Pourbus and the old man, he discovers that the old man is a painter. His name is Frenhofer. In the story, Poussin has not only barged into a stranger's studio, he's barged into the world of contemporary art, which is rife with contradictory ideas, riven by irreconcilable opposites, and beset with raw problems which are going to come to a head, which are on the brink of crisis, which will blow up in our faces. In his description of Pourbus's studio, Balzac lets drop that there are many drawings on the walls that are études à trois crayons, drawings made with three-colored chalks, black, white, and red. This fact immediately aligns Pourbus to Flanders, to Flemish painting, and specifically to Rubens, the great Flemish master. Rubens was the initiator and the most famous exemplar of drawings made with three-colored chalks. From this fact alone, from his alignment with Rubens's aesthetic, we can infer that Pourbus is a colorist. Color is important to his paintings, and therefore he is indirectly related to the Venetian tradition in painting, to the sensuous, coloristic art of Titian and Veronese. Balzac makes this quite explicit. However, in the case of Frenhofer, there's an even more pronounced connection to Venetian art and to what today we would identify as an extreme kind of painterly painting. At first, Frenhofer gives qualified approval to a painting by Paubus, which he's been invited to appraise. But encouraged to speak his mind, he becomes severely critical of it. His criticism starts to bite at what we clearly recognize as conventional assumptions about painting, drawing, and representation. These critical ideas develop a great deal of cogency as the story continues, but I'll try to summarize them later on. Before the dazzled eyes of Poussin, Frenhofer picks up Paubus's palette and brushes and begins to correct the painting, dramatically improving it. He puts a touch here, a touch there, in small, jerky, disconnected movements, which seem on the face of it quite irrational, but they transform the painting magically. Having performed this breathtaking demonstration, the three leave Paubus's studio and accompany Frenhofer to his house, which is nearby, close to the Pont Saint-Michel. He invites his visitors to join him for lunch. Some of Frenhofer's own paintings and some valuable old master paintings he's collected are on view and make a huge impact on the naive and eager Poussin, who pricks up his ears when Frenhofer boasts of a painting he's been working on in secrecy for 10 years. This painting, of course, is le chef-d'œuvre inconnu, the unknown masterpiece. Frenhofer calls it la belle noiseuse, the beautiful nut girl. Poussin's desire to see it becomes stronger by the minute. However, Frenhofer is not ready to show them, nor anyone else, his epic labor of love, the perfect beauty which he says he has brought into being. Poussin sees an opportunity when Frenhofer happens to remark that he would like to compare his painting to a perfectly beautiful living woman. Quote, an irreproachable woman, a body whose contours are of a perfect beauty, and whose complexion, but where is she to be found, this elusive Venus of the ancients? Poussin realizes that his mistress, Gillette, is exactly this kind of woman. Driven by his indomitable ambition, Poussin is able to persuade Gillette to display herself naked to Frenhofer. Her consent is accompanied by infinite sadness and disillusionment with her lover, who will be, in effect, prostituting her. But a bargain is struck, and Poussin and Paubus gain admission to the studio to see La Belle Noiseuse, the unknown masterpiece. Frenhofer's studio is dusty and cluttered. There's a wonderful moment when Poussin and Paubus rove with their eyes, trying to locate this epitome of ideal beauty. But they find nothing corresponding to their expectations. So they ask Frenhofer to point it out to them. The rumoured masterpiece, they discover, is in fact no more than, quote, colours massed in confusion and contained by a multitude of bizarre lines which form a wall of paint. It was, quote, a chaos of colours, tones, indecisive nuances, a kind of fog without form. Frenhofer's years of solitary labour had unwittingly brought about, quote, a slow and progressive destruction of the image. Made suddenly aware of his failure, Frenhofer set fire to all his canvases the following night and died of unexplained causes. What a story! Here are some images which will serve to recap a few points. That's a self-portrait by Nicolas Poussin on the left, and on the right is a painting by Franz Pourbus, a portrait of an unidentified gentleman, which is in the permanent collection of the Art Gallery of New South Wales. The real Nicolas Poussin would have been 18 years old in 1612, the year that Balzac set the story, and the real Franz Pourbus would have been 43. And here's a drawing by Rubens, done in 3-coloured chalks. Pourbus, in the story, had a studio full of études à 3 crayons, drawings done with 3 different coloured chalks. In 1912, the year Balzac chose to set his story, Rubens would have been 35 years old and at the height of his renown throughout Europe. And in 1831, the year the first version of Balzac's story was published, Rubens's reputation was undergoing a momentous revival thanks to the emulation of Rubens by the brightest star of contemporary painting in France, Eugène Delacroix. We know that during the early years of the 1830s, Balzac repeatedly met Delacroix in the houses of mutual acquaintances. One of Balzac's stories, La fille aux yeux d'or, the girl with the golden eyes, published in 1835, was dedicated to Delacroix. When Balzac revised Le chef-d'œuvre inconnu in 1837, this new version almost doubled in length, due for the most part to long passages of what we might call art speak. But it's not blah, blah, blah. It is, for the most part, intelligent and authentic, and there are echoes of those passages in Balzac which we can find in Delacroix's journal, and even more so, very strikingly, the very phrases used by Delacroix's acolytes and by the art critics who took up his cause seem to be echoes of Frenhofer's pronouncements. It's very likely, it's almost entirely certain, that Balzac consulted Delacroix while drafting these important revisions of 1837. To be sure, the chef-d'œuvre inconnu wouldn't be the allegory of modern art that it is without those vital additions. In the story, Frenhofer moves rather gradually in his critical commentaries. He scatters hints, he sows doubts until he makes a declaration. He has a problem accepting the convention of drawing outlines, of delimiting figures, of separating things from their surroundings. He has the chronic problem, which Henri Bergson much later called a refusal to countenance the fiction of an isolated material object. And here is how Frenhofer describes the alternative approach to representation which he has developed. Quote, "I haven't marked in a dry way the exterior edges of my figure, because the human figure doesn't finish in lines. Nature provides a series of roundnesses which are enveloped one within the other. Strictly speaking, drawing doesn't exist. Perhaps one should not draw with a single line. Perhaps it is more worthwhile to approach a figure from the middle, latching onto the prominent parts that catch the light." In fact, every utterance of Frenhofer's here could have come out of Delacroix's mouth, and very likely they did. Here is Delacroix's great champion, the critic Théophile Sylvestre, describing Delacroix's approach to drawing. This was published in 1864. Quote, "Delacroix's distinctive way of drawing is very free and much less detailed than all the attempts by others to imitate it, as he swiftly sees things in their ensemble, that is to say, in the guise of a sketch. He doesn't fail to abbreviate them. Each of his pencil marks becomes characteristic, generalizing, and it defines volume before all else, emphasizing the protuberance of bodies and the direction of their movements. Because of this, he doesn't impinge on that imaginary limit called line or contour, which is where objects are thought to finish." Unquote. Sylvestre, along with other contemporary commentators who were fans of Delacroix, seized on the aberrant features of his approach to drawing, of his approach to representation, and in fact greatly exaggerated, greatly overstated his infraction of academic norms, i.e. the purported shunning of contour and outline. What these commentators were affirming, in effect, was a resemblance between Delacroix and Frenhofer. How strange is that? The antithesis, the polar opposite to Delacroix, was his contemporary and rival, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Here on the left, a drawing by Ingres, and on the right, a drawing by Delacroix. This can be seen as a face-off between classicism and romanticism, between academicism and anti-academicism, between modernism and tradition, between order and anarchy, between one orthodox approach to drawing and another delinquent approach. Théophile Sylvestre was especially nasty in his appraisal of Ingres, and I quote, "The purity of contour, the stiff neatness of the silhouette within which Monsieur Ingres never fails to insert his personages, as if he were hindering them from moving, makes them resemble figures made of wire." The Delacroix drawing on the right represents a lion hunt. The hunter has come off his horse. The horse has been downed by the lions, and the knot of their struggling limbs is choreographed with an extraordinary grasp of relationships, movement, and drama. Delacroix's synthetic abilities are astounding, of course, and that makes him, in the estimation of Sylvestre, up there with the best draftsman in the world. This is a portrait of Balzac in his famous dressing gown, beside it the cover of a brilliant study, which pieces together from all Balzac's writings a philosophy of art. The author is Mark Eigeldinger. Frenhofer's aspirations, Mark Eigeldinger explains, belong to the sphere of impossibility. He is disconnected from reality, so disconnected from common sense, and has so far exceeded and overshot the means of articulation and communication, yet his crisis isn't individual. It isn't merely attributable to madness. Beyond his personal failure, Frenhofer is an enunciator of modern art. He becomes an emblematic figure, first and foremost, because of his social alienation. Frenhofer is not painting La Belle Noiseuse as a commission, nor to submit to an exhibition, nor to give to an art dealer for sale on the open market. Although exhibitions and art dealers weren't so much a feature of the 17th century art world when the story was set. Frenhofer is more like a contemporary of the 19th century people that you see here, people who are subject to a deep cultural pessimism. Who or what is the public? Who or what is the audience that an artist or writer should address? Frenhofer painted in order to assuage a deep-seated personal need, and that was virtually the beginning and end of his story. Others may create for a select circle of their peers, or they might pin their hopes on posterity. In 1840, Balzac received a letter from a contemporary novelist, Stendhal, saying that he, Stendhal, didn't expect to be understood or read before 1880, 40 years hence. Being unpopular, being a failure, being unknown and unappreciated wasn't necessarily an altogether bad thing, given the cultural pessimism that had become so prevalent among the artists and writers of Balzac's generation, when popular success didn't need to be courted since it had no correspondence to merit, no correspondence to inherent quality or authenticity, and was no index of genuine appreciation on the part of the public. Failures could be considered, and indeed they were considered, to be a seal of authenticity. In Balzac's own case, notwithstanding his immense fame and the huge sales of his most successful novels, the indifferent reception of his early works and the nasty reviews his books received were his real medals of honor, according to Émile Zola, who idolized Balzac but couldn't refrain from drawing attention to the literary critics who were hostile to him. After Balzac's early novel, Les Chouans, a novel which was relatively well received, Balzac said, quote, the whole critical establishment let loose against him, the battle commenced, every new book he published was dragged in the mud, unquote. This painting, Homage to Delacroix, painted by Fontaine-Latour in 1864, is very much about the martyrdom of artists by a Philistine public. Flanking the portrait of Delacroix on the left is James Whistler, and on the right, Edouard Manet. In 1864, Whistler and Manet were both egregious failures. Whistler's painting, the White Girl, that is to say, a woman wearing a white dress, and Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe were marked out for a scandalous reception when they were exhibited in the Salon. Fontaine's painting was submitted to the Salon the following year, showing the targets of vilification in the previous Salon, alongside Delacroix, who had also fallen afoul of public opinion once upon a time, and had received a terrible drubbing in the press. Yet by 1864, Delacroix was recently deceased and had long ago won the reputation of an uncontested master. Nevertheless, despite Delacroix's large number of public commissions, the major paintings acquired by the state, and the star billing he received in the Universal Exhibition held in Paris in 1855, and much besides, Baudelaire cited Delacroix's setbacks, his failures, and his relative unpopularity as his true badges of honor. Quote, "Never has an artist been more attacked, more ridiculed, more thwarted," Baudelaire wrote in 1855. Baudelaire was 22 years younger than Balzac, and so the epoch-making revised edition of Le Chef-d'œuvre Inconnu came out when Baudelaire was 17 years old, and clearly Baudelaire was able to correlate the pronouncements of Frenhofer with the graphic practice of Eugène Delacroix. When Baudelaire started publishing art criticism with his Salon Reviews of 1845 and 1846, when he was 25 years old, his adulation of Delacroix drew him into the contemporary controversy about drawing, about the dubious function played by outlines and edges. In 1855, responding to the huge showing of Delacroix in the Universal Exhibition, Baudelaire grasped the nettle of Delacroix's unorthodox approach to drawing. Quote, "Delacroix's drawing, which has been so absurdly, so stupidly criticized, what is there to say about it if not that it is based in elementary truths that are completely misunderstood? A good drawing is not a hard, cruel, despotic, immobile line enclosing a figure like a straitjacket. Drawing ought to be like nature, alive and agitated. Simplification in drawing is a monstrosity. Nature presents us with an infinite series of curving lines, fleeting, broken, following an impeccable law of generation, where parallelism is always hesitant and sinuous, where concavities and convexities correspond with and pursue one another." And Henri Fontaine-Latour provides us with a wonderful example of just the kind of drawing that Baudelaire was describing. and that Delacroix or Frenhofer were advocating. Yet the point of Balzac's story seemed to be that the revocation of outlines, the porosity of the figure to the space and light circulating around it, resulted in the collapse of representation and a disaggregation of its constituents, released from their representational function, lines, colors, and tones, imploded into a chaotic jumble. We've seen one of Delacroix's drawings of a lion hunt, and here is one of his oil sketches, from which you can infer that Delacroix had his finger on the pulse of the violence, turmoil, upheaval, catastrophe of the revolutionary age they were all living through. You'll notice that this painting is a seamless continuum. You'll find it hard to discern where one thing ends and another begins. The conventional function of line to enforce separation, to induce discontinuity, has been well and truly negated. The inspiration for Delacroix's lion hunt pictures was Rubens, who, as I've said, Delacroix idolized. Here in the upper left is a lion hunt painted by Rubens in 1621, and on the lower right, Delacroix's lion hunt painted in 1855, which is in the National Museum in Stockholm. The breathtaking thing about these pictures is the incredible skill and daring of the artist's approach to composition. They evoke chaos and catastrophe, but they choreograph that chaos and catastrophe. Their chaos becomes cosmos. And there's something distinctively modern about this challenge of bringing organization to a state of sprawling disorder, with the result that Delacroix's paintings have remained relevant and inspirational in surprising ways to many generations of modern artists. Okay. This is a woodcut by Kandinsky's best friend and collaborator, Franz Marc, made in the year 1913, at a time when the representational traditions that had held sway in Europe for centuries were giving way, and the first abstract paintings were beginning to be shown in public. Of course, Franz Marc was one of the very earliest exponents of abstract painting. I think it extremely important to grasp how artists such as Marc would have looked back to the time of Delacroix and Balzac and responded in such a way as they did, recognizing in Delacroix a great pictorial composer who was able to evoke with singular vividness and directness crisis and catastrophe, just as they were able to look back to the story of Frenhofer and appreciate its pertinence to themselves as the inheritors of a tradition that was in the throes of disintegration, of crisis, and was in violent transformation. The turbulence, the violence, the catastrophism in Delacroix's paintings was very closely related to contemporary events and reflects the tenor of the time. This is a painting Delacroix produced in the same year that Balzac published the original version of Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu. It represents the barricades of Paris during the Revolution of 1830. The French state immediately purchased this painting, which is now in the Louvre. You could say that this was a crisis painting, just as Balzac's story of Frenhofer belongs to a literature of crisis. Liberty Leading the People, that's the title of this painting, is displayed in one of the biggest gallery spaces in the Louvre, and nearby it is another whopping painting by Delacroix, The Death of Sardanapalus. Whereas Liberty Leading the People was an instant hit in 1831, this other painting, The Death of Sardanapalus, had met with a dismally negative response when it was exhibited in the Salon of 1827. The legend of Delacroix as a martyr to the Philistine critics and ignorant public relates quite directly to the disastrous reception of The Death of Sardanapalus in the Salon of 1827. You will note that this is a crisis painting, and that is another instance where Delacroix proves himself a brilliantly resourceful choreographer of chaos, turbulence, and graphic violence. The scene represents an Oriental potentate whose city is under siege, hence he resolves to commit suicide, taking all his goods and chattels with him. Delacroix's literary source was a poem by Lord Byron. But the Parisian critics would have nothing of this painting. For one, it was a potboiler with neither top nor bottom, a vast, colourful sketch lacking sense. For another, it was a kaleidoscopic improvisation truncated on four sides. In other words, the way that figures in this painting, on the sides of the painting, had been cropped, was seen as an infraction of what was considered permissible in a pictorial composition. Everything had to be contained within the limits of the frame. Others tut-tutted at the licentious nudity and overt violence, surmising that this was due to an overweening ambition to gain attention and to deliberately stir up a scandal. It was the worst picture in the year's Salon. It was uncouth, it was unworthy, it was incomprehensible. The painting was unsaleable for 20 years. Then an English collector bought it. Then it resurfaced in Paris in 1861 in an exhibition in the Galerie Martinet, where it was reviewed by Baudelaire and where Cézanne, Degas, and other Impressionist painters would have been able to see it for the first time. That's a photo on the left showing a copy of the engraving of The Death of Sardanapalus hanging in Cézanne's studio in Aix-en-Provence. And here's a very interesting juxtaposition between The Death of Sardanapalus and a painting by Kandinsky, where the affinity between the two painters will probably take you by surprise. Kandinsky emulates this kind of crisis painting, the apocalypticism of Delacroix, while his painting also lays bare the confused melee of colors, tones, and lines that Balzac had envisioned in Frenhofer's studio, a figurative image that has been submitted to, quote, a slow and progressive destruction. But that slow and progressive destruction had been wrought over the course of the 19th century by successive generations of artists. Balzac's story was something Paul Cézanne took very much to heart. In a questionnaire Cézanne filled out, he called Frenhofer his favorite character in fiction. For Cézanne, it would seem, Le Chef-d'œuvre inconnu was a cautionary tale, about freedom. Frenhofer is free, whereas the other characters in the story are not. Balzac emphasizes that Frenhofer has independent means. He's rich, and so he is free to paint what he wants, how he wants. He is also free to fail in an unbearably extreme alienation, captive to his own obsessional delusions. Frenhofer's crisis was, in effect, a consequence of his freedom to flout conventions and ignore the commonly held language of art. It is important to recognize how the incomprehension of Frenhofer's peers corresponds to, and may even be a projection of, his own anxious self-doubt, of the pessimism and paranoia born of his isolation. These are two magnificent drawings by Cézanne on the screen, and you'll have realized, I hope, by now, that they are drawings conceived from the inside out, so to speak, not from the outside in. Outlines, contours are no longer in control of representation. And these are two pages from Cézanne's early sketchbooks that have become associated by tradition with le chef-d'œuvre inconnu. It's a very recent and very flimsy association begun by the German art historian Kurt Barth in 1955. There's nothing to substantiate any connection with Balzac's story and these drawings, so you can take it or leave it, and I'm inclined to shrug it off. As we've heard, Cézanne nominated Frenhofer as his favorite character in fiction, and Émile Bernard also described an astonishing incident that occurred during one of Bernard's visits to Cézanne in Aix-en-Provence in 1905. Bernard happened to mention Frenhofer's name, and Cézanne suddenly leapt from his seat, tears streaming from his eyes, jabbing at his chest, mutely identifying himself with Balzac's tragic painter. Bernard published an account of his visits to Cézanne in the Mercure de France in October 1907, and these articles were widely circulated among artists. They were certainly snapped up by Matisse, Picasso, Braque, Derain, everybody who was interested in Cézanne at the time. Indeed, Bernard's memoir was prefaced by an epigraph from le chef-d'œuvre inconnu. Frenhofer is a man impassioned by our art, which he sees further and more loftily than other painters. He has pondered the absolute truth of line, but perforce of his investigations, he has come to doubt the very object of his quest. Balzac said that it is the property of a good fable that the author himself does not know all the riches it contains. Nothing truer could be said of his fable of modern art. The existential issues in Balzac's tale, the issues of freedom and alienation that Cézanne took so much to heart, were not nearly so compelling to Picasso, who was nonetheless very much impressed that Cézanne identified so closely with Frenhofer. Here you have Picasso portraying the artist and his model, endowing the artist with Cézanne-like features, and endowing the picture that he is painting with the non-representational shambles that Balzac attributed to Frenhofer's picture. And here are another two etchings by Picasso, which are facetious portrayals of Frenhofer's dilemma. In the image on the left, the painter is so amorously fixated on his model that he's paying no attention to what's happening on his canvas. In the other image, the painter is oblivious to this wonderfully gawky, winsome Amazon, who is his model. He only looks at his canvas. And the outcome of this disconnection is similar in both instances. Frenhofer's reworking of his picture over a period of 10 years brought about a slow and progressive destruction of the image, a prospect that struck fear in the notoriously obsessive character that was Cézanne, whereas, on the other hand, Picasso could see a positive value in the destruction of an image. He told Christian Zervos in a 1935 interview that painting, for him, was, quote, a sum of destructions. I make a painting, then I destroy it. But in the final account, nothing is lost. The red I took away turns up somewhere else. Quite unlike Frenhofer, then, there was no quest for the absolute in Picasso's art, no hankering after ideal beauty, truth, nature, etc. On the contrary, Picasso explained, art has always been art and not nature. From the point of view of art, there are not concrete or abstract forms, but only more or less convincing lies. So much did the subversive ideas about drawing, ideas like there are no lines in nature, drawing should avoid contour lines and delimitation, and so on, ideas that had been propagated by the fame of Le Chef-d'œuvre Inconnu, no doubt, as well as by the critics who reviled Ingres and academicism and supported instead Delacroix, then the French Impressionists, then Seurat and the Neo-Impressionists, and so on. These contentions made sufficient impact on orthodox thinking that in 1852, the Minister of Public Instruction appointed a commission to investigate the teaching of drawing in art schools in France and to advise on its regulation. The commission was headed by this man, Félix Ravaillason, who was an eminent philosopher and was also an accomplished painter who exhibited under a pseudonym in the salons. He called himself Lachet. Interestingly, Ravaillason frequented Parisian high society, and from time to time, in various illustrious drawing rooms, he would come into contact with none other than Balzac. The drawing on the left, by the way, is by Chasserio, showing Ravaillason as a young man. Ravaillason, in fact, wrote about drawing in various publications, and it's quite remarkable to find echoes of Frenhofer's pronouncements, basically the notion that you approach drawing from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Ravaillason cited in this regard Leonardo da Vinci, not Frenhofer, not Balzac, not Delacroix, as his authority on this point. In Leonardo da Vinci's treatise on painting, Leonardo says that a human figure is characterized by an undulating or serpentine line which is uniquely the property of someone's posture, and that the aim of the artist should be to understand its determining influence. As Ravaillac paraphrased this, quote, "The secret of the art of drawing is to discover in every object the particular way a central wave travels through its entire length, which radiates out in subsidiary ripples, a certain fluctuating line which is, as it were, the generating axis." This principal line, the key to drawing, is actually invisible. It can only be intimated through insight, through imagination, by the intelligence. But this principal line is the source and center of the general disposition of a figure, which develops outwards from it in ripples and shudders. Yes, it could almost be Frenhofer, it could almost be Baudelaire, it could almost be Cézanne who is doing this explaining. And so to conclude, here you see the centenary edition of Le Chef-d'œuvre Inconnu, published as a collector's book by Ambroise Vollard in 1931. The book was illustrated by Picasso. No doubt Picasso relished the irony that Frenhofer was able to read a seamless illusion of nature, that he could see La Belle Noiseuse in the tangled skein of lines and colors, which, to his colleagues, was no more than an indecipherable scroll. So we've come to understand, I hope, what Balzac meant when he remarked that Picasso was moved and stimulated by the idea of taking the place of the illustrious shade of Frenhofer. And we've come to understand also, I hope, the profound truth of Balzac's statement that great fables exceed the intentions of their authors, authors who cannot know, who cannot even guess the rich implications their tales will hold for posterity. Thank you for your interest. See you again.